Hello everyone, welcome back to Pakistani Writings in English. So far in this course, I have talked about four topics. First of all, the debate surrounding the use of English language in third world literatures. Secondly, brief introduction to Pakistani literature in English. Thirdly, the issue of representation of native culture by Pakistani writers, and fourthly, native reception of this representation by diasporic writers. I believe if you have followed these discussions a bit attentively, they'll help you develop better and more mature understanding of different Pakistani writers and their works. From today onwards, I'll focus on the two texts I have chosen as primary texts of my detailed analysis of different important issues as explored in those works. So I'll be looking at Mohsin Hamid's novel The Reluctant Fundamentalist and Wajahat Ali's play The Domestic Crusaders. And while looking at these two primary texts, I'll focus on how they have explored the issues of 9/11 Islamophobia, representation of the native culture, and issues of diaspora. First of all, let's begin with a very brief introduction of these two works. As far as Wajahat Ali's play, The Domestic Crusaders, is concerned, it revolves around the celebration of 21st birthday of Ghafoor, who is the eldest son of the family. The children have gathered at their parents' house to celebrate this birthday party, and this is where all the play, all the action takes place. The play juxtaposes minor family conflicts with major national and international crises that these characters are facing, especially crises of culture and identity for Pakistani American Muslim immigrants in post 9/11 era. And although the characters are of Pakistani Muslim origin, their story is not exclusive to them. It is equally easily applicable to the immigrant generation when they have to deal with their fully integrated American progeny. So the conflicts and problems that these characters encounter are common to all immigrant generations. Once the next generation is reared up fully adopting the cultural and life values of the host culture, it leads to a significant conflict between the two generations. The first generation attempts to cling to their cultural roots and try to preserve this origin by passing it on to their children. But the children who do not have the first hand experience and exposure to the first culture, and whose affiliation to that culture is only uh, through their parents, do not find themselves quite comfortable to practice and believe the same things which their parents are in favor of. Ismail Reed, who is Wajahat Ali's teacher and instructor, and for whom he actually wrote this play as an assignment, wrote in his introduction to the play that it is a kitchen drama, the sort of play that concerns itself with food, dating, sibling rivalry, intergenerational conflict, humor, and pathos. Now, if you look at the name itself, the title itself, it reveals the comic nature of the play, The Domestic Crusaders. How Wajahat Ali compares the family members in conflict with each other, which is obviously, as I have just mentioned, about minor family issues, to crusaders, warriors from Muslims and Christians who fought with each other over the control of holy sites. And these crusade expeditions were actually fought between 1096 to 1291, and there are 8 major crusades fought between Muslims and Christians over the control of holy sites like Jerusalem. On the other hand, we have Mohsin Hamid's novel The Reluctant Fundamentalist. Now, this novel is about a few hours of a chance meeting between a Pakistani man who has quit America after 9/11 attacks and a mysterious American tourist whose identity and motive of visit to Pakistan is not revealed by the narrator. Now, these two men sit and take tea together in an open air cafe of Old Anarkali, then share a meal before walking back through the darkness of night to the American's hotel PC, where he is staying during his visit to Pakistan. Now, the novel is actually Changez's story of his student days at Princeton, his growing love for Erica, and his meteoric rise to number 1 in a US valuation firm, Underwood Sampson. And in this novel, he narrates his American life experiences, the kind of life he spent in America during his educational and working years, and then his return to Pakistan with unrequited love after 9/11, and working here as a university lecturer and an activist. So this is what the story is about. Two people sitting together and talking to each other. On the whole, the novel is an exploration of complex issues of Islam and the West, fundamentalism, and America's war on terror. Now, one thing that is quite interesting, even intriguing about this novel, and this is what infuses aesthetic force into this novel, although the story is a simple one and a short one, is the innovative stylistic devices that Mohsin Hamid has used. First of all, he has used dramatic monologue. So we have a Pakistani protagonist, Changiz, talking to an American listener. And this is what all the action is about from beginning till the end. So in a way, he has used the form of novel and turned into a theatrical performance in which we have two characters on stage talking to each other and nothing much happens. But despite that, this is his stylistic experimentation with different conventions of novel, which actually invigorates the story and keeps the reader entranced, curious to know more about what Changiz has to narrate. And similarly, we have Changiz telepathically understanding the Americans' thoughts, reactions, and responses. We have this, even if you look at the scene I have just described, two people sitting on stage, but interestingly, this is only a monologue. The other character does not utter even a single word throughout the narrative. This is all one-sided conversation coming from Changiz, the protagonist of the novel. Now, even this strategy of allowing Changiz to speak and silencing the American is very significant and can be analyzed at length. So the silence of the American can be interpreted in two ways. It is a manifestation of his complacency or a deliberate attempt of Mohsin Hamid, the writer, to subalternize the American. Let me explain what these two interpretations actually signify. Now, if we say that the silence of the American implies his complacency, his refusal to bother about the strong opinions and scathing and blunt criticism of American foreign policy by Changiz shows that from the perspective of the American, who, if you locate it in the dominant discourse, finds himself in a more powerful position. If we talk about the concept of binary, self and other, he is by not responding to Changiz's ideas and comments, especially on America, identifies with self, that is superior, and he does not feel any need to contest American representation by Changiz, because he believes this aggression, this criticism, this open rejection of American supremacy and interventionist approach by Changiz does not count as long as he is the one, being the American, being the self, being the dominant one, to control the very discourse itself. Similarly, this complacency also shows a sort of miscommunication or lack of communication between America and Pakistan. Changiz is doing his best, almost desperately, to voice his opinions on what he finds unpleasant and objectionable, condemnable. But the American, on the other hand, does not comment, as if his opinion, Changiz's opinion, does not matter. So this attitude does not allow the dialogue to take place. That is why we have monologue. On the other hand, it might also signify a deliberate strategy by Mohsin Hamid to silence the American in this conversation. And this is what we can call in post-colonial terms that he has given him the status of a subaltern, which becomes ironic. I mean, if you just remember the way I have just explained the American's complacent attitude, the way he identifies himself with the dominant of the two in the binary, this silence of the American signifies how the writer has deprived the American of expressing his comments, his viewpoint in response to that of Changiz. So the novel, in post 9/11 context and in the context of US-Pak relations, silences the American deliberately, intentionally, so as to allow the Pakistani interpretation of events to have all the space of the narrative. Because in international discourse, America is the one being the superpower to hold authority over how they are represented, or how a certain country or culture is represented. So the novel, by deliberately silencing the American, gives all the space of representation to Changiz, to Pakistan. Now this was quite brief introduction of these two narratives. Now I'm going to talk specifically about 9/11 and Islamophobia. So here in this discussion, I'll talk about 9/11 catastrophe, its basic details, and then history of American aggression, what Islamophobia means. Here I'll also use ideas from Mohsin Hamid's prose work Discontent and Its Civilizations. Next I'll talk about how Changiz thinks of American dream after 9/11 takes place, and then his radicalization. So first of all, 9/11 catastrophe. You know, this is a terrorist attack on the Twin Towers of America, World Trade Center and the Pentagon. when two planes hit these two towers and destroyed them in 2001. Now, this attack on the American soil was an event yet unprecedented in complete American history. And this event actually changed the world and its politics for decades to come. And this is where, America started invading many Muslim Middle Eastern countries. Now, if you look at the way 9/11 has been described by Changez in the novel, interestingly, he juxtaposes film, fiction, and news, three genres, in the description of 9/11 scene. So if you read page 35, you will find how he mixes together all these three genres while talking about 9/11 attacks. Now, this juxtaposition of film, fiction, and news is quite an interesting observation by Changez. And to begin my own argument, first of all, I want to highlight how the mainstream media was manipulated by the state to represent the Muslims the way it suited, favorable to the aggressive policies that the state has had to adopt, wanted to adopt at that time. So mainstream media played a vital role to support the agenda of the state. Here I want to quote a few lines from Usman Ali Salim's thesis for PhD. He says the Western, particularly US media and film discourse constructs Pakistan as a nation of religious extremists who are devoid of any progressive social and political agenda. Now, this is how they used media to their own advantage. And for the sake of my better understanding of manipulation of media, although media seems to be a platform where the journalists, political analysts are free to express their opinions on urgent contemporary issues. But in fact, if we look at the very system and structure of media and society, we find that they filter all these views so systematically that only those ideas and opinions which are favorable to the state or their policies are aired. So here Chomsky wrote his seminal work Manufacturing Public Consent in 1979, talking about 5 filters which media is based on. So everything that is on media goes through these 5 filters, and only that idea or those ideas are left behind, which do not expose how the state is manipulating media for their own vicious political goals. So I do not want to go into detail about those 5 filters, but I'll be using some of Chomsky's ideas from his other works so as to elaborate on some points I'm going to incorporate in this discussion. So media, as I said, has been exploited for a certain role that is needed and required by the state at a certain critical juncture of history. Now, if you go back to Ismail Reed's introduction to Wajahat Ali's play, even he is referring very clearly to highly controlled media and how they play a negative role to exacerbate the conflicts between groups and races, between countries and states. He says that he recommended and suggested Wajahat Ali that he should write a play about an ordinary Muslim Pakistani American family, one that would counter the ugly stereotypes promoted by a media that sees its profits in raising fear and dividing ethnic groups and races. So here it is quite evident that media plays in the hands of the state, politicians and big interest groups to project an image of a certain group that serves the purposes and agendas of the people who actually fund these media groups. Stephen Morton here adds that the media uses verbal and visual images of the Muslim world to justify Western economic and foreign policies. Now here the agenda becomes too obvious, that these verbal and visual images of the Muslim world, who are portrayed as fundamentalist, potentially terrorists and barbaric, not because they are quite reporting objectively, rather selectively, and the actual goal is to justify to the world at large all the economic and foreign policies being adopted by the West towards those countries. Here I just want to give you a quick example of Madeleine Albright, the US ambassador to UN, who was once asked about 500,000 Iraqi children dying as a result of America's economic sanctions on Iraq, and what she said in response was not only brutal but quite revealing about the psyche of these powers. She said, although it was a difficult choice, but all choices considered, it was worth it. And even after that, the economic sanctions on Iraq continued. So these media representations of the Muslim world or any other country are not motivated by fair, unbiased reporting or portrayal of these groups, these people but to justify their own coercive militaristic actions being carried out against those groups, because otherwise uh, it would be easy for the world to call them uh, cruel and unjust. But through media, they actually pave the ground for their own belligerence and aggression towards the world. And there are these uh, ulterior motives that nobody talks about and highlights. For instance, as the discussion moves on, I'll discuss with reference from Chomsky how the Middle Eastern conflict is actually fueled by the oil. So their major concern was not to civilize or liberate the people living under, let's say, the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein or any other, but to access oil or other resources which they wanted to use to their own advantage. Now, if you look at media and the way it has been used in Wajahat Ali's play The Domestic Crusaders, at one point Salman says, when he comes back from work, tired of this goddamn heat, goddamn media, same nonsense every day, blame Islam, blame Muslims, blame immigrants for everything, tired of the daily propaganda. So even Salman, although he has lived in this culture for years now, for decades, still finds himself to be alienated by the vicious propaganda that is run by media groups. And then he goes on to add another comment that I want to add here. He says, so Iran is making weapons now. Why don't you tell us who sold it to them in the first place? Jhoote, haramzade. The two words that he uses from Urdu language. Jhoote means liars and haramzade, bastards. Who's that? Right, another American general telling me why the Muslim world hates us. America. Everyone is an expert. The rest of the family is illuminated, now aware of his rant, the way he is expressing his ideas in anger. Morons, absolute idiots, liars, liars running this country, the worthless media, the oil companies, Muslims, useless also, stabbing you in the back. So here he clearly talks about his own frustration and distrust of media talking about the American conflicts with other countries like Iran. So he just mentions one instance of Iran and the rumors about their making weapons, and then he blames America for selling these weapons to them in the first place. So basically his dialogue reveals hypocrisy of American state, how they change their loyalties according to their own advantages. And here I'll be once we move through this discussion, I'll be referring to how the Afghans, the Taliban, were supported, funded, weaponized by US in their war against the Soviets, because at that time America wanted to establish itself as an unipolar power in the world. So here it becomes quite evident how media offers selective representation that is to the advantage of the state. And for the sake of elaboration, I want to quote a few lines from Chomsky's interview. He said, so the concern over Middle East terrorism is highly selective in all sorts of ways, just like the concern over Islamic fundamentalism. The most fundamentalist state in the world is Saudi Arabia. I don't see a lot about that. Why? They do the job. They make sure the profits from oil come to the US, so they can be as fundamentalist as they like. This is the most shoddy and shallow propaganda. It's amazing they can get away with it. So this is basically the point on which my argument is based, that US attitude towards these different countries, especially Middle East terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism, is motivated by their own ulterior agendas. They are not going by principle. Rather, they only target those who somehow pose a threat to them, who challenge their authority, who refuse to succumb to their pressure. That is why, as Chomsky mentions, they target Islamic fundamentalism, but their relations with Saudi Arabia, who is, as Chomsky explains, the most fundamentalist state in the world, but they are good friends only because they have their interests there by making profit through oil. So the relationship with Saudi Arabia is not disturbed, their fundamentalism is not challenged. The US does not think about somehow playing their role to liberate the people living in Saudi Arabia and free them from the oppression of the state by introducing civilizing values and freedom of all sorts of ways. I mean, all the rhetoric that is constantly used against other countries, especially as we saw in the case of Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan. But their relationship with Saudi Arabia remains intact because they're making profit from their oil. So the idea is that this agenda of the state, who to represent and how, is easily achieved by manipulation of media. So media becomes a huge and very destructive tool in the hand of the state, not allowing a comprehensive picture to emerge, not allowing any alternative perspective that might highlight the state involvement in condemnable crimes. So that is why, I mean, if you have looked at some of the interviews by Noam Chomsky, the people whom we call dissidents, who have a differing opinion on various important issues, contemporary issues, are not invited on mainstream media talk shows, because they only want those people who can express their uh, you know view viewpoint in a few words, in a few sentences. And this setting itself, the way your ideas, the way an interviewer uh, has a dialogue going on with the interviewee, the person who is invited in the talk show, is sandwiched by commercials. So it does not allow you to express your ideas with evidence and data. You can only speak in white and black. So this kind of media becomes a dangerous tool to uh, play in the hands of the state. Now, this point about the manipulation of media has been briefly explained by me here, and since the topic is still long enough, I'll continue with it in my next discussion on the same topic, in which I'll talk about how different stereotypes emerged and were used against the Muslims in post 9/11 era, and how they were discriminated, and how this stereotyping and discrimination has been explored by these two writers in their respective works. So we are going to talk about all these things in my next discussion. So for the sake of conclusion of today's discussion, let me just say that Islamophobia was constructed by the state through media, and it led to the alienation of well integrated immigrants in Western countries, especially after 9/11. And this led to disturbance of earlier pleasant relationship with between the immigrants and the natives. And this plight of the immigrants is actually an issue that must have been addressed on human grounds, but instead the state had to think about their own certain agendas which were their priority, instead of thinking about how this propaganda campaign was affecting their own law abiding faithful citizens, although their only fault was that they were not natives, they came from a different background, a different country, a different religion. So in the next discussion we'll be continuing with the same topic, adding more and more aspects to develop a detailed comprehensive analysis of Islamophobia as it has been explored by Mohsin Hamid and Wajahat Ali in their works. Thank you very much.